Rangdum Gisin Ranjuki Kiwi Chawak and Nitubine Shishin Tianje, Kiwi Chawa to Gores, just not Danganju, Shishin Matin Baina, and Sim the new Mobu Choso, and the Danjin, the new Mobu, new Mobu Wongi, Mazingama, Kawasashi, Kawati Gepard, and the chick Manyam, then a Divasa, then a DP Wongi, DP Chawa Chindu. Divasa, DBT Wongeta, Kiawachima, Gondroma, Kiawa Lendures, Kiawa Limbazada, Dendra Kiawa Gudi Meba Chavasa, and Dendra Kiawa to Yamas, Dendra Kiawa Lenje, and then Devi came, Dendra Tigi, launch at the Shasameva, Odus and Chagores, the names are down to Shishin, the Tengo at the Kichimores, isn't that the Koshu Ronson?
Good evening. So last week we looked at the great importance of vigilance, and that in every every virtuous endeavor that we engage in, it's imperative that we rely on vigilance, because if we do not, the afflictions are going to arise again, and they will limit the quality or the strength of the virtue we are accumulating. And if they arise even more strongly, instead of accumulating virtue, we will engage in accumulation of non-virtue. So this will mean the virtue that we have accumulated will be counteracted by an ongoing accumulation of negative karma, of non-virtue. And this may well mean that despite making some attempt at virtue in this life, when we die, we may well be reborn in the lower realms, meaning our opportunity for spiritual development is lost. This precious opportunity was not fulfilled and was rather lost. So in this context, we looked at the great importance of relying on vigilance last week.
제가 당초 시신 세진 저 제모를 제외나 강제볼 제한으로 지나 또 시신 그다 소소리아디 폴리데 거투도 민스 파다 되겠는데 디르와다 시신 소소의 강보담데 리기도 민스베 다다도 다간디다 시신 소착으로 디 삼로 디네 따디게 삼로 줘라디 디 시신 쇼로다 다디네 소소의 강보담 레디 파 디초를 휴고를 해서베 쟁게 휴고 제 삼당한데 잼바로다. 진짜 디 잼바디기 어디 디슈고래서 잼진 파주에 디 잼바로. 진짜 디네기 잼벌이 디네 제시시 유여돼. 제간주기 지 칼라 세베네 제시신 된거다. 칼라데 비네 추망타 더기데미데 파 다한디 시신수차. 디네 오다 망타데 망타도 쳇디 루고래서 배 삼당한데 잼바샤고. 디나시 당주기 도시네 내가 지기 가르 제비네 제마다 시신제 지다 시신디기 망도 추도 망초도 민데 마다와이나 가르리 망타와 가르 뉴트랄이로 하죠. 제가 되네게 용으로 되네 자다 만주게 가르 제비네 지게 시신나 잼바 시신다 시신 야범 마딘 바샤야데 되네 교연셔야다 되네 잼바 마진 비게 되네 노저 차야데 용으로 하다 되네 자다 만주 제 시신 세팅가 삼다베나 베네 나중에 삼로 나려야 다든가 저기 유치원 삼다데 나중에 삼로디 뇨모베 나려 뇨모베 기기 소소 삼로데 뇨모베 기기데 기기민도 소소 삼로디 뇨모 기위 유지를 조우데 조금민도 삼당한 따디겐데 시신식으로 받아 디따 되겐데 소바나신 디따 되겐데 시신체 디네 삼로디 시신체 디네게 삼로디기 안에 지 뇨모베 기기요 받아 하고요도 남사 하고요도 딘 잼비 오데 디삼 지교마디 지게와 지고를 선배다 비네 소주바데 소주교 말해 선배 삼다 템바 템바디가 템바식으로 와데 인자당은 저 시신의 템바시아디 언도신의 된 시신세 삼다 남사 디니지라 로레야 샤르토바 지고로 와당도 시신세 디로 템바디게 볼데도 다 슈고레서 슈에디로 와데네 딜슈고를 포기들 때오래서 이제 잠바디로 와서서
Mindfulness and vigilance are two minds we need to employ at all times, because they serve the function of ensuring not only that we accumulate virtue, but that our virtue grows and flourishes. In other words, our virtuous ways of thinking, we become ever more habituated to them. So therefore, at all times, we should be relying on mindfulness and vigilance. And in fact, often we are. In our everyday activities, we utilize these minds. So for example, if one is either playing football, soccer, and one is watching, can imagine there the role that mindfulness and vigilance plays. Vigilance will be ensuring that we maintaining the ball. Mindfulness is deciding what is the best course of action. Do I pass it? Do I score? And so forth. So as meditators, we need to rely on mindfulness and vigilance, certainly in our formal practice, but actually in all walks of life. We should be utilizing it to ensure that vigilance plays the role to ensure that our mind is not afflicted. This is easier in the quiet time of formal practice, such as now or in meditation, but it's something that we require from vigilance at all times. Mindfulness, this needs to be holding the mind to a virtuous object. Whatever we're engaging, we need to have in either the forefront or in the back of our mind a virtuous object, virtuous way of thinking. And as we saw last week, it's imperative, the mind of vigilance, the mind that is on the lookout for the arisal of afflictions, that this doesn't fade away. Because if it does, mindfulness is going to be lost. Because with vigilance, not standing guard, the afflictions that we remain so habituated to will arise unnoticed. And then our mindfulness of a wholesome object will be overwhelmed by our deeply habituated afflictions. So therefore, it's imperative that at all times we keep our mind virtuous. To do this, mindfulness holds our mind on virtuous thoughts, but vigilance guards it from being overwhelmed by the arisal of afflictions. And if we do so, our virtuous ways of thinking will become deeply habituated. And this is usually expressed as them growing in strength, flourishing.
That Shijingi Semdi Chilo Chuk do Minus, Nile do Minus, and the Jik Doshin, Doshin, Jevachi, Nile Roche, Hagoda, Lamsa, and the Jin, Nimale, Donald Jambatin, Jedushin, Jewa, and the Maji, the Negi, and Dushikaya, Jikdu, some Gaya, Jik Delia, Tenshi, Tempat, Kasa, Shijin, some Gaya, Matadu, Jashavane, and Giligilish, not home nom, the Chazini. Agility Nikulea, the Nikulea, the Yanga, Yungorwada, the Nezada on Zugi, the Shishin said that, Pene, Givicha, and Yamne, Javala, the Gomjala, that are 10 Shishin, the Chikioji, Chimochagorwada.
The context that one usually hears about mindfulness and vigilance presented is that in the development of single-pointed concentration. So therefore, by training from right now in cultivating mindfulness and vigilance at all times, later it becomes much easier to have powerful mindfulness and vigilance and thereby quickly develop single-pointed concentration. Because if one tries to hold an object single-pointedly, but one's mindfulness and vigilance is poor, then, as all too often happens, one gets a little bit sleepy. And if vigilance isn't noticing it, the sleepiness will overwhelm the mindfulness of the virtuous object, and we'll start to doze off unnoticed, and suddenly we'll startle ourselves awake. And that there is a sign of vigilance not being present.
Sem soya de la, sem de nyomobo chuso matanga che, sem geyu choso shaya de la, ne de sem songa se de sem nyomobo chuso pa song che, matanga che, geyu choso shaya de. De shaya de sem soya de garche ro se ne, shi nan jemba nigi, oso dian chen de sem songo gore ese che. 다 되네 인자 당은 시신기 매바이나 안 교인 가려 열었으니 그생도 수도 쉬르와 다 되네 인자다 다 잠바데 시신 송야래야 잠바 땡고 그래 사실 다 잠바 땡고 그래 지자 시신데 야고 용야래 잠바 땡고 그래 잠바 송 그래 다 되네 마 디슈고다 되네 인자 디마 쉬야래야 다 당보 돌려지 쉬고 할 때네 가서 그래 대외에서 대외 잠바 이권에 구이도 남야 메동고 송나 안주 네바다 잠버지데 냐버샥
So last week, when we looked at the 27th and 28th verses, there we looked at the importance of vigilance. Because whilst both minds of mindfulness and vigilance are indispensable, first last week we looked at vigilance, and now we're about to come to look at mindfulness. Because these two minds together serve to ensure that the mind stays on a virtuous object and is not overwhelmed by the afflictions. It's through mindfulness and vigilance. They are the guards that keep our mind virtuous. Mindfulness, recalling or holding the virtuous object. Vigilance, making sure that the afflictions do not arise. So last week, we looked at vigilance. Now we come to look at mindfulness. The 29th verse. Therefore, never allow mindfulness to separate from the doorways to the mind. Should it occur, intentionally recall the many pains of the lower realms and firmly place it closely once again.
Davis, Jemba Yikones, good on Namyamidongos, and Davis, you do that, kissing him at the Sigurdash. When Shijim Martin by Shijim Mevaina, Shijin Yidusine, and the same Mason Vaina, and the Gundis to us at sometimes you were kissing. Tangan to Shijim Mason Vaina, Tangan to get same day no mobile choso pie, Shijin Mevaina, same day no mobile choso sonche, and then no mobile ye, and no mobile ye and do, and the no mobile on gate Java, and Shanlia, Tevia Java, Nube Java, Chine, Dibachimbosa. Dibachimbosa, the Tangamegi, Yama Sunam Sasha, but Yipa Yam. Then, and that Yamba and Zatan Yama Gewachima, Dendriki, Yukawa Sasha Bata, Denigati and Yam. The Yam rode the dinner, and the Garcios and the sheet of the Kawakis and the Gandol Maki to what is. Then Gandol Keva and the Gandol Dunga, then the United Party, two sheets of some time. Then the Yungore. The name Zada, and that Gandol Kio de Gene, Dendriki, Kawati, Yamba and Zada, Dendriki to Yomaras, Dendril Makiwaza, and Dendriki, Dendriki, like the United Yomares. Ducine Tichazata, Shijin Matimbi, Wangi, Yomo, Baki, Yomo Begida, Gyendo, Shitine, Shijin Matimbi, Gynd in the shadow, Asabeda, Davis, Gynd in the shares, or Ducina Samta, Davis, Gynd in it. Dine in some under the Carjorson, Jamba, the Jambiting or Echida, Jamba Carating Orson, Jamba Yi, said the Jamba, Sosugi, Jamba change, Sosugi, Semdi, and Kivichol, but out to change, Kehol party. Jamba, he said, Susugi, same, he said, same. Chesa Rangi, same the Yomo, which was Motomaji Kidina, Kawachi, Kiwi, some logilita, not to a Kawachi meet 2 years, 2 watching, Kawala meets in a Jambiki Tustin, Kawal mean shower, yes, or that. Chesa, David, Jamba, he said, Jambiki, Jamba change, Jambiki, same, Kawachanya, change, and do shower, yes. Mother, do shower, yes, or Jamba, he said.
The first word, that of therefore. The therefore links to what we've just looked at. And what we looked at then again last week was that it's imperative that we rely on vigilance, because if we're relying on vigilance, which always is serving at the back of our mind, watching for the arisal of the afflictions, ever vigilant, ever alert, looking for the presence or absence of the afflictions. And if vigilance is not present, the afflictions will arise unnoticed. And if the afflictions arise, our mind that was engaging in virtue becomes overwhelmed by the afflictions. Now we may continue in whatever it was we were doing, but our mind has gone somewhere else. Now it's gone to the negative side, the afflicted side. And then by our habituation, to our afflictions being strengthened, we may well now be acted upon, saying or doing something non-virtuous. So in this way, by not relying on vigilance, non-virtue will be accumulated. And this means the virtue we accumulate will be less frequent and of less strength, and our non-virtue may well be more frequent and of greater strength. So therefore, whilst we may have the thought that generally we've been okay in this life, the great pile of non-virtue that we've accumulated in this and previous lives hasn't been adequately challenged. Therefore, when this life ends, this precious opportunity is lost, and we fall to the lower realms and experience unimaginable suffering. So that is the consequence of not relying on vigilance. So this is the first term, therefore, is linking to what we've just covered. Then the verse continues. So the first two lines in our English are quite mixed from the Tibetan. So therefore, and then the next word is mindfulness. So therefore, we need to also, in addition to vigilance, rely on mindfulness. Mindfulness is the indispensable companion to vigilance, and the place it needs to be placed is at the doorways to the mind. But we actually didn't get to the word of doorways yet. So after the word mindfulness comes the word mind. So mindfulness, this mind needs to be placed, or needs to be present rather. Let's say it needs to be present.
On the tempiki rangi yi semdi kewal kyang samta shagores or that is tempiki part shagores. That in a shadano she can shagores and answer that ushine some damage. That the negi chike social shell never cheva in a digi diverse and also like it to worry, just de deneza shall never hear some of the past dang gosh and that shall never saw in the chicken same big some rush to style. And ya chicken that denigi gave us some tire. That rangi denigi and Dungali Tadala Cubi, nobody surely kept the conscious on the Yori, same big camera some tire. Denigi Susugeda, camera san down you, Dene Rangi, and the chicken. Sayatunya that Dinekane, Chikabi, Kablia, Ya Concholi, Chebupuya, and Dinigi, and the Susuke, Chikal Hamaroje, Dinekala Hamaroje, Susu Samato, Uyarusine, Shen, Semjelia, and Busina Disuli, Chimbayin, some jet pa, and some Nadus to Uyala Sopa, Jayala Sopa. Dinigi and Semjem Yamda Kanga, Dungai, Nawara, Toy, and Ninja, Sambi, Nija Samtaya. Ajik Pension that Janasa Manzuki, the Denike Pension Trubojada, Shen Trubojada, Marja Solos of Tony, or this Chasa that Denike Trubojadi, Sam Condo, Yomo, Shahano, Sona Chigura, Ninja, Sambiki, Nijicomia, two Sene Chick Bene Number Pension, Marji girls, Denike. Nisro going the Lamsa, that Deniki, she Ramaba, Condo, Shamano, Son Chick, Ninja, Sambiki, that Ninja Sambe some time. Denichi and some Marja, Denichi, Ganga, Mambo Trigger, and Ninja Sambe some time. On Dushine, Ninja some Korea La Sobada. Denigaton, Sosuke, Kiwichao, Sosuke Chao Karishu, I think he let the Shanley Pempa John Show, Digi Shangy, Dunga said, Shangy Digitally, Pendogi John Show some some time. On Dushe, and the Dangazuki. Denigi some of the Gidina, Denigi, Kewajanya tend over Chida, Dembik, Rangi Yidi, Ya Kewal Pa, all the Shapa, mean Shamatamache, the Yomo Chusmata, Kewal Pa, Shashabatella, and the Temba East, or that Tembik, Sem Kewal, Jen, Chikidina, Tado, Semki, Rangi Simdi, Kewal Pa, Jen to Pacho, SS, Secret that Temba East.
So we have the two last words in the first two lines, mindfulness and the mind. So this mind of mindfulness, we need to ensure it is always placed on a virtuous object, which is a technical way of saying our mind needs to always be virtuous. Because mindfulness can be placed on virtuous thoughts and non-virtuous thoughts. We can be concentrated, mindful, whilst being afflicted and thinking non-virtuous thoughts or engaging in non-virtuous actions. So the mind of mindfulness at all times needs to be placed on virtuous thoughts. And this is imperative, because then Through mindfulness and vigilance working together, we will accumulate extensive virtue. So when vigilance, for example, notices the rise of an affliction, for example, that of harmful intent, mindfulness should then immediately remind one or recall the faults of the afflictions. In particular, in this case, in this illustration, harmful intent, the fault of expressing this affliction through speaking badly to or about someone, or acting in a way physically that brings harm to others, and remind ourselves of the faults that follow from doing so. And mindfulness then can also be utilized to immediately draw the mind either back to where it was, and that virtuous way of thinking, or to a virtuous object. For example, if one is feeling challenged again and again by these afflictions, go for refuge. Mindfulness then can take you to the virtuous object of refuge, reminding one that by relying on the guidance from the three jewels, we will be able to train our mind and gain freedom from the afflictions. Taking courage and strength in this, we can remind ourselves of the teachings we've heard, all through this word of mindfulness or recollection or remembering. Remember the teachings we've heard on refuge. Remember the teachings we've heard on the faults of the afflictions and their antidotes. And in this way, with vigilance and mindfulness, the arisal of the afflictions can be noted and repelled, and the mind can remain virtuous. Also, for example, through mindfulness and vigilance being utilized well together. When one's finished one's meal, seeing some leftovers on our plate, we can then, thinking of the merit that now can be acquired by practicing generosity, we can then, instead of just throwing the leftovers away, we can give it to animals to feed them. And in this way, we can create merit. And this act of giving leftovers to animals to eat can either just be an act of disposal, and then it's not going to be particularly meritorious, or it can be an intentional act of generosity, whereby great merit can be accumulated. Likewise, if one is going about one's daily activities with mindfulness and vigilance, mindfulness is keeping the mind on virtuous topics, probably various virtuous topics. And thereby it will be quite easy when seeing an animal to recognize that whilst perhaps its appearance is pleasing to us, or perhaps not, depending on the animal, compassion can arise that whatever animal this is, it's bound in the lower realms. It's suffering from its greatly limited intelligence and lack of capacity to deal with the challenges in its life. And we can generate compassion and the aspiration that in this life, its non-virtue is purified sufficiently so that it can achieve a precious human rebirth in its very next life. And in this way, just walking around, seeing an animal can lead to the generation of virtue. But this comes about in dependence on mindfulness and vigilance. Likewise, when we observe conflict in the world, whether it's on a personal level, someone engaging with us in an unkind way, in an aggressive manner, or we hear about others who are in a relationship with conflict, or conflict between peoples or nations, if one is relying on mindfulness and vigilance, mindfulness will already have the mind on a virtuous object. Then it'll be quite easy to turn to further virtuous objects such as compassion and wisdom, recognizing that wherever there's conflict, the aggressor is deeply afflicted and is therefore suffering and in pain. And not only that, but is acting in a way that is unskillful, causing harm to others now. So all parties are suffering, and they are creating the causes that they'll suffer ever more in the future. And in this way, one can generate compassion for both the victim and the perpetrator. In this way, through the generation of compassion, when either being on the receiving end of conflict or observing it in the world, with compassion arising, the wish will come, may I be of benefit, may I develop my virtuous minds ever further, so that those that I do have direct contact with, I can only benefit them and bring benefit to their lives, and help at least in this way to reduce the conflict in the world. And so in this way, by relying on mindfulness, the mind staying virtuous, even when we experience or observe non-virtue in the world, virtue will arise in our mind and we will accumulate merit ourselves. So in this way, by relying on mindfulness, we can keep our mind virtuous and free of the afflictions.
Dine samdana de usine jembege gewa samdaya de. Dina sindanga jogi gabrianga juji gabrianga juji 최대인제 참점 줘야다 루제로 제 지거로 받아 dine gabri ne nga samdana de gewa sayar 받아 다 samno gewa 직샤할 수도 당이 xianlia 판도 주야다 xianyi 동아시아 xianlia 디기 주야 xianlia 판도 제발라 나 수부 탕고 고도 샘플 흘려지 고도 제자다 이 수부 탕고 매바 아니 지금 수부 내나자다 강아지네 최소는 예시한라 간에 로봇지도라고 지도 말에 제자야 xianlia 판도 주야다 xianlia 로봇지에게 된다려야 나 수부 탕고 고도 뒤 된다려야 아니 지금 루제 조치 제게요 받아 되네 루제제야다 되네게 안도시네 cambiam chỉ cho đi chế độ insan về sam ta về nè, chỉ rằng cũng là sam lo kế hoạch của nè sam ta chỉ cho lưu chỉ chế độ, chỉ rằng đến cái số số cambiam cho cái cái bên đó lưu chế về cái bên đó, đến cái sam ta đó, anh chỉ sam lo để kế hoạch cho bao nhiêu cái rồi, ông都现在 sam ta 也多。
And again, just to emphasize this, these minds of vigilance and mindfulness we must employ at all times, not just in formal Dharma settings. So, for example, when exercising, one can utilize this period of intense movement of one's body in a way that leads to the accumulation of virtue. So how so? So whilst one prior to exercise, one generates motivation and keeps this presence in one's mind whilst exercising, reminding oneself that in order to be of benefit to others, I need to have a strong and healthy body so that I can cultivate good qualities and I can interact with others without easily tiring or experiencing other physical difficulty. Therefore, I'm going to spend this period of time, or I am spending this period of time, strengthening my body so that I can be of ever more benefit to others. I can interact with them with more ease. And even though I'm experiencing some physical discomfort now as I'm huffing and puffing, by doing so with this good motivation, through the strength I'm building within my body, may I develop this strength in my mind as well, so as to engage with others, whomever they are, in whatever distraught circumstance there may be, may I engage with them with skill and love and care. So in this way, by engaging in the most mundane of activities of exercise, one can generate tremendous virtue. To do so, it's imperative to rely on mindfulness, keeping our mind virtuous.
람사 털 팔에 주 네버기베네 팔에 네버 렌디 람사 네베고네 렌지 네버치고 팔렌 렌로에데 삼는 코고로와 디네자 디메임바자 안주게 람사 젠비기 땡치나 소소게 폐기 미에 삼로 안주 네베 삼바테다 미니디 예와라 체제 제자다 그 네베 삼바디 셴리아 안주 네베체게 삼로디 그 삼로 야부 마르와 디바르와 그런지 삼다베네 디부차고로와 제자 디네 삼코 제요도 람사 미딜이야 미디닝제다 그 유길에 삼랑 안바 내내 체바지비게 디네 네베체 삼로주 코와레 제자다 미코론은 닝제 선비게다 미코론은 닝제 삼다 다 그게 삼랑 안바디 다디 디 야고 말에 코론야 디부사고를 야고 말에 닝제다 콜디 디 삼랑 안바디 매바 쇠다 탑람제 미 탑지제 매바 쇠기 미디 간에시나 코 매바 쇠게 탑람 간에 토나 코 매바 쇠야디 미 탑지 제인세베 삼다베나 아지 콜리아 닝제다 콜리아 아니 강하세기 아니 펜베 삼로 콜용도 아지 디야 개와차고로와 제자데 잼비게 삼로티게 람사 디네 삼로 잼비게 디네 잼바이나 네 개회 삼로 콜샤고 개와기 용마도 네 개와 디바기고 말아 제자 디네게 삼땅고 레송으로 하다.
Just bearing in mind that this word translated as mindfulness is also the word for memory or recollection, or we can say as holding in mind. So when others, again to take an illustration from daily life. When someone is criticizing you or complaining to or about you, the usual response is to respond in kind, stand up for yourself, defend yourself, and put them in their place. So this is the usual way of responding. But in dependence on the many teachings you've received and the reflections you've engaged, and you know that's not skillful. So intellectually this is known. You have knowledge of how better to respond and why it's harmful to respond in such an afflicted manner. But if one's mindfulness and vigilance aren't well developed, one is going to respond in the way that one's habituated to, not the way you want to. But if you have trained well in these topics, and your mindfulness and vigilance are also well developed, then in that moment, when someone is complaining to or about you or criticizing you, immediately your mindfulness will recall your training. Because this is the role of mindfulness. It's mindfulness or memory or recollection. It will recall your training. And it will recall what this person is expressing is an expression of their mind. And if their mind is afflicted, that is why they are talking in this way. So therefore, this is not really about you. There's no need to take this seriously or personally. Rather, this is an expression of their afflictions. That's why they're talking in this way. And this use of wisdom comes about in dependence on using mindfulness to recall your training. And independence on mindfulness, which led to wisdom, which will then lead to compassion for the suffering being arising, because you recognize this being before you is in pain. Their afflictions are causing them to suffer, and their way of dealing with their suffering is to complain, to criticize, to scold. So now your mind is compassionate and it's calm and spacious because of initially mindfulness, wisdom, and then compassion. Now you can think how best to respond. Should I explain the situation? Should I apologize? Should I say nothing? What would be the most skillful way to respond to this suffering being? So this is how, through training in developing mindfulness, one is able to deal with real-world situations in skillful manners, not only ensuring we accumulate virtue, but that we do no harm to others.
So the
these are a few illustrations of how one keeps one's mind on virtuous objects at all times. And in this way, one can skillfully throughout one's day engage with the various events we encounter and accumulate merit and be of benefit to others. For those whose minds are perfectly trained, the Buddhas, and those who are approaching that state, the Bodhisattvas, this is how they live their life. Mindfulness and vigilance, ever dominant, and therefore they are constantly being of benefit and doing no harm and creating extensive virtue. So there are many differences between ourselves and these great beings, but really what this is showing is the great difference in habituation. To the extent our habituation is to the afflictions, this is how we go through our day, this is how we respond to the various events we encounter. And to the extent that we are habituated to virtuous ways of thinking, to that extent we respond habitually in a virtuous manner. And to train our mind towards virtue requires mindfulness and vigilance. Mindfulness, keeping the mind on the virtuous objects, and thereby developing our habituation to virtuous, non-afflicted ways of thinking.
Sem gewa sam tawa de loso guidu se loso se orda sem gewe sam dile loso da nyomo be migiwe sam tawa de guidu namya me dongo zawgi ne da gyo mare gidi ne da gyo mare se orda me dongo se sem gewe choso sam tawa di dile loso ane gidi na du namya ane dusine sem di me nyomo be choso da gyo mare se.
Let's look at the rest of the first two lines. Therefore, so we've looked at therefore, mindfulness and mind. So therefore, never allow mindfulness to separate from the doorways to the mind. So what Shantideva is saying here is mindfulness should be at the doorways to our mind, ensuring that whatever we are thinking about, whether it's something we are seeing or hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, or we are thinking about a thought. These are the doorways that our mindfulness needs to be standing at, ensuring that whatever we are thinking about it with a mind that is virtuous. So we engage with everything that we see, hear, think of, and so forth with virtuous minds, never through the afflictions. If mindfulness becomes separated, the afflictions are going to arise. And then the things we see, hear, or are thinking of, we'll be thinking about them with an afflicted mind. So here the training is to never allow mindfulness to separate from the doorways to the mind for the reasons that were highlighted previously, hence the link with therefore.
The Namya Midongo in a Zawi Duki Nancy or a Duki, Danganzuela, Chikitus, Galesharamena, and give you some ratan, and the Chikitineta, and Chikanga, or Daddy did Chiki Garanas and Beyanjik, some new Chica, never get that Chik Yungurova pass some do a time, the TV Chawachiata, Yungurova, Cisadineza, and Namduya, Gedinada, Hulu Shibenada, and Sosulakanga, Cassit Heavina. Myomo somebody, give each other, Migo shot on your mares, Migo the Sungures, Tangazo Sola Babia Sungures, and the Lemrim Nala Son de Kisinima, Son de Chesaturim Son de Ye, so Sola Babia Sungures, Chesa Sola Baba in a soda part Juliation part Surim Sungures, a dinner, she down to get Namdoya said, Gedina, so Ganga got this Ganga Kidu Kanachubina, same do Yomo chose Miguel said, Unikichu Mare, Detroit Unitagio Mares, some Gawad, Mibatilla Mata, which is Jogores, Yaman Jogores or.
This expression never allow and then to separate. So this is very clear. Shantideva is not leaving scope for exceptions or this is too hard for me. What's been made very clear through this usage of never allow is that there is never a circumstance when we should not be relying on mindfulness. No matter how challenging a circumstance we encounter, we should always rely on mindfulness. In the Lamrim, this is often expressed as even at the cost of our life, we should rely on mindfulness. This is the determination we must take to ensuring that our mind always stays virtuous, no matter the hardships we encounter. So when we are quite comfortable with relying on mindfulness of a virtuous way of thinking when things are going well, when we're in good physical shape, when we aren't encountering difficult people or around things that we deeply desire or dislike, then we can keep our mind on virtuous ways of thinking. And this is excellent, but we need to build on that. we need to build much further, so that life's challenges we can deal with skillfully, in particular through keeping the mind mindful of virtue.
In sona ngandre nyoba ta temperature de nyawar sha se sona ngasne kabrelia manjugi tempa pachi che tempa metemba che sem nyomo bo sho sonwa ina so sona dene sonwa na lamsa ne garche horasne dene ki pa deshi dene sonwa na lamsa tempi ki tenji no oda sem de nyomo bo sho sonsha chi be tempa tempa nyam che da kabrelia sem de nyomo bo sho sonwa ina ya lamsa tempi tenji de garche horasne delia dene metin du kabla song yu mo bu song yu gar sam dang wo ne dene ngan ju ge ne ba sam dang wo re se re ngan ju ne ba pen da oda nyu mo ba ke ne du che ba na de di ba sa di bi wong ge ngan ru le ke wa le ngan ru ma ke so na da nya wa yi da dun ru du nga ba do me ba nyong gu wo re sem be ge dene ge ngan ju ma ke ba na ngan ju ka nga du nga gi so so ne bi ge ka nga di gi pa sam da ja oda dene ge dele ke ne pe sa dene te tar gu wo re sem be ge dene ge ane tar du ge sam ba ke je ya sem ge wi cho su ya jen gu re so.
Third and fourth line. Should it occur? So the use of should it occur is the recognition that whilst training, there certainly will be times when mindfulness loses its virtuous object. Vigilance is not standing guard. But again, through the usage of should it occur, this makes clear that as aspirants for the Bodhisattva path, this should really only be happening on occasions. It shouldn't be something that is commonplace. We really need to make great effort to ensure that mindfulness and vigilance are minds we habitually using, are commonplace to us. Nevertheless, when there are those occasions when our mindfulness of a virtuous object is lost, as soon as this is recognized by vigilance noticing the rise of the afflictions, we should, it continues, immediately recall. Now this word recall is another way to translate mindfulness. Mindfulness, memory, recollection. So immediately recall the many pains of the lower realms. So this then relates back to that first word, therefore, which was a link to the previous verses. As soon as we recognize our mind has been overwhelmed by the afflictions, it's now in a negative way, remind ourselves of the karmic consequences that will follow. And then Shantideva continues and firmly place it closely once again.
Now, this is an Andrew getting Andrew never the Ganga do sometimes the dinning Andrew the Limatan Pesas and Big that Denigate Tardu somebody do the Niggy and the Kiwis, okay, what you were in Bikawalite, temperature. The Nigging Andrew nobody pass him the Jen did Andrew do what the Tarwood and Pe somebody or Chizan never didn't join the tone do the Nigella Tarwood is Ganga de la Tarwood and somebody get to her Chizan Diniza Gabriel as you get. Jamba nyam che kiwi migi we chawal chiguyo bana che sona andi namsa ngandugin ai ngandul ma ki do ngandul ke bana nyawa ida tundu kanga tin shongre chesa den du chen de neba kanga di pa den gore den yo de ne ane semdi pa dele tawu sembi de tardu ge samba ke yo de ne zada semdi gewal pa nyawar sha semdi gewal che chi bu sha gore se de chesa ke we samlo de che chi da de ne ge zawo ne ji bi ke 지금 매 선배가 삼는 개발 봐 세시도 샤고래서 녀월 샤서야 돼 세시도 샤바시 그러다.
This final part of the verse, firmly place it closely once again. So this arises from vigilance, noticing the rise of the afflictions, and that mindfulness has lost the virtuous object. Then mindfulness immediately recalling the sufferings of the lower realms, recalling the karmic consequences of a non-virtuous mind. And if you are well trained, the fear of having to experience the sufferings of the lower realms again, will jolt you back to the virtuous way of thinking that you were engaging in before. So this is the meaning of firmly place it closely once again. The mind is once again being placed in virtue, being jolted away from the afflicted way of thinking, and once again in the embrace of virtuous minds.
anda danda la sikje dige danda da dor dune shuwena tanga juge da sem shijin mason aje ani sosuge samlo de nyomo bo choso ta sha ba ina dine an digi kien je na de divasa dibo wange da ngandol kya 동아 빠도 매바 용고 차이도 선배 되네게다 시진 마서 견내 삼제 두치네 삼다 되네자다 셈디기디 내다 녀모가 쳐서 마다 셈디 개화견야 전국 개화를 견야 지기 셈디 개화견야를 야 삼다 샤고도 셈 되네게 전체 셈디 개화파 견야샤 두치네 개화견야 삼다야게 레가다 지난 자와 가르치베나 룡하게 자와 가르치베나 셈디 개회 털바 쪼도바지기 두시고레스 두치네 되네 셈디 안지 개뒤네 뒤남양 강하기도 가르쳐베네 셈디 뇨모버 쳐서 따겨 말레스 게시다스 카브레라 템퍼처제 셈 뇨모버 쳐서 이나 안에 가르치고레스는 간주 녀바디게 삼다 간주 녀바게 데레게네 제요도 데레 탈도게 삼바게 용으로 디네자다 셈디 개발을 야게 개발을 샤고레스 어도나 녀바디 딘데도 더도 쉬샤바나.
Summarize the meaning of this verse then. So if vigilance has failed to notice the arisal of the afflictions, mindfulness will lose its virtuous objects and the mind will now be afflicted. So to help prevent this happening, we both need to ensure that vigilance stands guard and that mindfulness is holding the virtuous object. So we need to therefore, now moving beyond the word therefore into the verse, we need to ensure that at all times we are mindful of a virtuous way of thinking. And we need to do this no matter what we are engaging in. So no matter what we are seeing, hearing, or thinking about and so forth, we need to be ensuring our mind stays virtuous. And when there are those occasions, so now the third and fourth line, when there are those occasions when our mindfulness is lost, and vigilance then wakes up and notices that the afflictions have now overwhelmed, immediately mindfulness should remind us of the faults of the afflictions and the karmic consequences that would follow. And if these have been well reflected on before, then immediately we'll be jolted away from this non-virtuous way of thinking back to the virtuous way of thinking. And in this way, we will continue with our accumulation of virtue. We will continue to abstain from engaging in non-virtue. So therefore, in brief, the way to keep vigilance and mindfulness present is to, one, have the determination to do so, the very clear set, repeated determination to do so, and secondly, that when they are lost, and that loss has been noted, immediately to recall the karmic consequences of now being under the influence of the afflictions, and thereby pull oneself back to virtue. And this is the way then, in brief, to rely on vigilance and mindfulness.
남사 되니까 깔래 하고로 왔지 간 스팅코 템바 간데 송고 띵고를 세도 다데마 또 삼다나도 수시하고래 두시지 마 개바라 송고래 되네 손데다 데카르 송고라스 라마다니 조발레 캔비 지수 템바당 지비 깔리는 귀제바 템바델라기 니도 예스.
The 29th verse then was a overview or brief explanation of relying on mindfulness. And now we come to a more expansive presentation for us beginners. So the 30th verse, from being close to their spiritual mentors, through preceptors' subsequent teachings, and through fear, for those of good fortune and who are devoted, mindfulness arises swiftly and with ease.
lama no think give shin chen den ba ji give shin den go re so da give shin den and give shin den ne give shin di and ji ge de la den nga ju ge da give jawa nyamlen ji de la mi gi ka lop na lama la den nga ju ge ge wa ya ne ya de ge wa je ba yu mu ro sam no ge wa sam ta na and ne za da lama ta den go re lama den and lama den no drop ba le sa lama den ji ne de lama de le pa 양도 맞아봐 라마다 예 냠도 맞아와 라마다 맞아와 냠도 되어진데 라미 구드네 도시네 아니 지게 최시 아니 야네 양도 도시네 최시 라미게 손셔봐 될이야 아직 퇴삼 제지 냠는 제지 도시네 개와 두고래 해서 개와 다 템바 도시네 땡고래 승고래
The method to cultivate stable, powerful, transformative mindfulness at all times requires the first line, from being close to their spiritual mentors. So this at first involves relying on a spiritual teacher, but that mode of reliance, that way of relying, here is expressed as from being close to the spiritual mentor. So this means that from your side, from the side of the students towards their spiritual teacher, to develop a connection, to be therefore through developing a connection rather than having a separation, an emotional separation between oneself and the teacher. Through developing a connection, one will be ever more open to their guidance. Therefore, the teachings on, for example, how to cultivate mindfulness will touch you and will inspire you to strive in training your mind in the way being presented. So that's the meaning of from being close to their spiritual mentors.
lama de taring buro tosha bene den lama zen shu go che yo mare ani yu ra go mara me de da yang chi temba de giwe chawa de nyam re nyanga yor ba de sa da lama de yang rong do ma che bu zhuo ba se de lama da chi nye bu re shu che de che ne zhuo ba de nyam do ndo shen de shu che la me zen de shu yang se du shen de du shu ho re che sa da lama da zhuo ba se lama da yang rong do ma che ba pa ta nye bu 냠도 쇼치네 되시네 라메전에 난데 도치네 개와 최슈 냠는지 개와 두고래 되네나 우도시네 또 야네 제제 되네 베네 니마직 다와직 로직 로숨도 시데 안도시 냠네 개위 자와지도 수수게 개위 자와 삼당의 템바디 다 땡땡땡 루레 송거라 라마단에 줘발레스
So one is relying on a spiritual mentor or a spiritual teacher. If one is relying on them, one will receive teachings from them and want to receive teachings. And these teachings, because of one having faith in the teacher, trust in the teacher, in that the teaching event itself, those teachings will touch you. This won't just be mere words arising and passing away, but they'll have an impact on your mind. This means in the formal setting where one is receiving a teaching, or later when one's listening to them again, those teachings will ensure you are accumulating virtue. Why? Your mind is on virtue. Your mind is engaged with the teaching topic. It's not merely passing you by, but you engage with them. Therefore, you are accumulating extensive virtue. Moreover, mindfulness will ensure that those teachings, because they've entered into you, they've touched your heart, you can recall them when needed. Recall them as you go through your life. Remain mindful of them as you go through your day. Whereas on the other hand, so this is one part of the meaning of this being close to. This is the emotional connection. The other part is one of physicality. If one is a physical distance from one's teacher, it's difficult then to receive teachings. And without being in their physical presence, it's difficult to receive inspiration from being in their physical presence. So therefore, the connection that one needs, this close connection that one needs to develop with one's spiritual teacher, is both emotional and physical. Being in the physical presence to receive teachings, as well as being emotionally close, so that those teachings enter into your heart. This means in the formal sessions, one is creating extensive virtue. But it also means one is able to recall those teachings throughout one's day, keep them in mind, be mindful of them, recall them, and thereby have them influence you in your daily life. This is the process by which, continuing this close connection over months and years, extensive virtue is accumulated. And this accumulation of virtue isn't something that one is unaware of. One's mind is changing, its way of thinking is changing. The teachings one is receiving are arising and abiding evermore in one's mind. And in this way, one is changing. And this comes about in dependence on this close relationship with one's spiritual teacher.
Geshe Thubten Rabten Sosyogedan Dushin Lama Damga Dingo Resh, that Damga Demba said that Geshe Thubten Rabten Damga Delia Yema Sung Sana Yane and Sunya Damga Jungore, Geshe Thubten Rabten are Masson Bajan Sardu Sunya Dele, Geshe Thubten Rabten, Geshe Thubten Rabten, Geshe Thubten Rabten, Dinesa can be get a campus and a Muti Dam de Lamas and the Dam de Lamas and Church, you do Lamigi, and the Garsorton. Geshe Thubten Rabten, Nyamna DJ, that Chana Nyamna did some didn't say Nyamni Jimbati, and Ya Jimba Sava Savatin, Jesin Lamedushin can be Geshe Thubten thing it is. Jesa Dinigi Geshe Thubten Tembatella, Rangi and Lami Tembatella, Tubi Dundalea, Yane and give some da, the name gave it the Mibo Gom do Chid, Temba dus in the Cavaria, and Rangi Sim de Kavala, Tembi, Temba dusus, more competent tango, such. Temba de Yane, some that Yagi tango is or then.
This then is the way to rely on one's spiritual teacher so as to develop good qualities, and all good qualities that you aspire for require mindfulness and vigilance. In the second line, through preceptor's subsequent teachings. So a preceptor and a spiritual mentor, we should understand them as being different terms, but for the same person here. And the subsequent teachings that one receives from one's spiritual teachers, in particular when one has developed a connection with a teacher, then those teachings one subsequently receives are going to touch your heart. They're going to move you evermore in the Dharma. And where, in particular, one is able to receive spiritual teachings on similar topics again and again, as one hears those same topics taught again and again, through this ongoing process of having a close connection with a teacher, those same topics and the similar words will enter into you in a different way, have an impact on your mind in an ever-growing way. So this then is how the good qualities within grow and develop through relying on the spiritual teacher over an extensive period. And in that period of reliance, to be receiving teachings again and again, even if it's similar topics, never tiring of that, because with listening with fresh ears and an open heart, those words enter in you in a new way. And through this growing strength of connection with the teacher, this leads to the ever flourishing of qualities within. And then, whether alone or in the general presence of the teacher, one recalls his good qualities, makes supplications for one's ongoing spiritual development, one's ever ongoing spiritual commitment to spiritual development. And in this particular context, one makes aspirations or supplications for one's mindfulness to grow in strength, for one's vigilance and mindfulness to be ever present, not to let the mind come under the influence of the afflictions, but to train precisely in the way guided. And in this way, one's qualities grow and flourish.
제다로 송바이 주베이나 지사 다랑 라메 당보 라마 젠 추이데 라메기다 지게 당보 겸로고 기위 신 된스니 꼼나 겸나 데데네 삼다고 디스콤 고레샤스 마송 데마젠디 냠렌데 오시아르체르디네 아니 지금 만주게 지와 메타바사다 어두시네 지와 메타바삼다다 지와 메타바삼다다 어두삼다 데네 만주게 누가 삼다시 데네 Jamro dus in the Sanda Jamdus Chores, Jamro Kopna, the Jamro and Jamro Labja did it in the Chores at Dus in Basso. On Dus in the Senate dinner, Denma, no Korigi, Koala and Gijonki, Tarpatonic, some Dus in Giores. And the nation dinner, Jamni in it, Semja Tamja Rada, the audio part of 2 minutes of cheaper, Semja, the other Jambanya Bata, Jamba Comia, the Ninja Comiana, the nature Semgomore, then a person looking Yamnachi was Dus in the Rimbajan Dus. Then then it is that Rimbajan Susuki Rimbe Yamnachi, Koya Yamnendi Badma, and Chick, Sem Kiwi, some not tiny the Pash Jambadi, that should church, a get church to Gorova. Tis Dineza can be just with Tembadas, what is more.
The way the meditation is guided in the Lam room is that one starts the meditation session first with a strong determination that one will rely on mindfulness and vigilance throughout the session and throughout the day. Then one generates refuge and bodhicitta, and then makes supplications to one's spiritual teacher, requesting one's lama's guidance and inspiration and blessings in this meditation and thereafter. And then one engages in the various meditations of the Lam room. First, the impermanence of this life, then the sufferings of the lower realms, recognizing that such a downfall, such a rebirth, is still possible for oneself. Thereby, one generates refuge within the deep reliance on the three jewels as embodied in the person of one's Lama. And then reflects on the sufferings of the higher realms. And this then, having reflected on how beings are suffering throughout the realms of samsara, one reminds oneself, not only do I not want to suffer in this way, but nor does any being. May we all attain lasting happiness, to generate love, wanting all beings to abide in lasting happiness, and generate compassion. May all of us, may all suffering beings be freed of suffering. And then, to make that a reality, one meditates on the 6 perfections. So such a meditation, having been guided by one's spiritual teacher, or being re-guided by one's spiritual teacher on how to engage in it, through one's close connection with him, through engaging in these meditations every day, these qualities grow in strength within. And this then is how we start to bring about the radical transformation of our way of thinking that we all yearn for.
제사다 랑기 셈 개와라 템비게 템바티 송야야 셴 랑레 셴 라마레 데네 안도시네 라마레 데네 랑기 개와 템바디 개별 템비 템바도신 송야제 제사 데네 엔자다 지베 세르다 데네게 다 소소기 지베 세르 당이 소소랑게 당이 아니 지게 베네 가소레 벤룽아 이스미 쮸바 개와 돈바 대당 송비 송셈 대단 가이비 룽아 준스미 쮸바 냠바 샬레 네베 차와디 챵바 이나다 베사그리 제자다 디바 디바 사용 디기 안에 개와 치마 나선에게 동안 용어 지기에 셈비게 되네게 나선의 동안에 지시에 안에 소수게 셈디 개위 녀모 쳐서 마땅하지 개위 쳐 송야다 주름 송야 안디마세 나중에 되네게 제 라바단 개위게 내가 제손다다 랑게 라메 까단 가두고 치사 라메 까단 가는데 지금 말해서 두시네 야 라메 까단 개위기 지바 되네게 시나 지시나 삼다야다 되네게 라바스나 개위기 개위 티바 제바이나 되네 디기 안네 레앙아 바스네 나선을 깨도 그랬으면 되네게 지비게 온게 지비 삼다지네 소수게 삼바디 안네 주름 가소래 다 미가와제 라바숨나 미가와제 라바숨나 네고래 해서지 송고를 지비해서야 돼.
In the final word, and through fear. So fear, in this context, we understand that in this reflection, one reflects that from not having restrained my physical behavior and my speech and my mind within the realms of what is, or the confines of what is virtuous, but having engaged in so much negativity, so much non-virtuous karma, I have these imprints on my mind. And they are what are ripen in my suffering experiences and may even lead to rebirth in the lower realms. I do not want to suffer like this. I will therefore commit to restraining, at the very least, my physical behavior, my speech, but ideally, my mind. Make extra effort with my mindfulness and vigilance at all times to ensure my mind is not afflicted, but virtuous. Moreover, with a deep sense of gratitude towards the tremendous, really the incomparable kindness our lamas have shown us, we commit to acting in accordance with all these teachings we've received, which means acting in a way that's virtuous, and also committing to engage in the 3 higher trainings, to strive in thereby cultivating his teachings within, with the foundation of ethics, and upon that foundation to develop concentration and wisdom.
Da kaden guje la side kawade tembeki. Jezada kaden guje la sine kadan sine kawade temba. Nyamlen chiga lam labasum nyamlen chiga kawade temba side sönam de temba sönam yede. Da kawa nyamlen chiga kawade tembe chanju semba. Chanju semba da lam nyamlen chiga koron zuge da mi sönam je koron zuge labasum nyamlen dus. Nangora kidi na kewa dusine gewi chola semne kewa kyanya chane kewa le nyamlen chiga. Temba tenche dushin gewi nyamlen chiga gore seme delia pe ya gore seme delia ngushep kya da gubache. Da konzo nyamlen cheba na ji ngi kya dini ji nyamlen che to jigin sebe samna ta che so so kewa di da temba de gewi chola sha gore ke ten guije la side kawa de tembe chen yusemba namji ane kono juge dushin so namchen kono juge talaba sum nyamlen dushin de kidina kewa dus nyamlen nangore sesan dina shin ji ngi kya pe ya gore sembi gu gubache pe ya gore sesan dina shin ngi kya dini che to jigin sebe samna ta je ane semdi kewa al pongan gewi temba 개월에 tembe temba de den sungu gore eshes kaiden guije la se kaiden guije la se de kaiden se de sönam je kawa de tembe sönam je janju semba koran juge laba sumye nyamlen de ne chigor pe ya gore se no gujepje nge kyang konzu nyamlen je ba na ji nge kyang nyamlen je to ba de jigi se be do sam dang gore je.
So I'm just going to move around the translation then of our 3rd line. So change it to with devotion for those of good fortune. So those of good fortune refers to those who have remarkable virtue, the Bodhisattvas, those who have attained the various paths and perhaps even grounds of the Bodhisattva. So having devotion for those of good fortune. So that's a better translation. Having devotion for those of good fortune, one will want to join their ranks. One will want to emulate them, follow their example. The way genuine devotion is expressed is not just a passive respect, but a wish to train in the way being guided so as to join their ranks to help these great beings in fulfilling their heart aspiration and lead all beings to a state freed of suffering. So this is the expression of one's devotion towards those of good fortune.
Lama rangi kiwi shin lama chengi timba ten lama zene ogati na lama da ta nyewo chro lama da ta chindu ma chimba lama da nyamdu je lama zene chue yang ne yang de shu chin so su ge ane zo kiwi sem kewa temba le ten ke temba kiwi temba samda ya andi na shin da lama ge ma ane rimba chu ni chue ten je be ten ba de ya an ten je ba de ya so su ge ane tue ba da 퇴비 된들 야네 양 삼대 개월 개 야네 삼다 퇴비 된데 검제 네 개월 샘디 잠바디 야 개위 개월도 되대야 야데 안데기 라바숨나 개위게다 내내게 제위긴가 봐 제바 있는다 다 내내게 나서는 기지 디바 강아 되는 용고를 샘비 되내게 코와 나서는 지부기 지바게 제텔에 안 타르게 샘비 토네 잠바대야 되내게 라바숨나 나 개위게 되네게 지금 디바 제바 있는다 야네 라메 까단 가그레스 라메 까단 간다 다 라마를 마고 바차베 야고 민도선베 되네게 삼단에 안 두신 잠베테 두시 잠베테야 되네 제까데 장주선바 고랑 중에 냠는 두스난 걸 빼야 버렸으면 구제게 디나신 혼전나지 제바된 얘기 냠는 두시기 선비 두신의 잠베테 두신 잠베템바 야네 두시 제바 있나 Jamba dela nido ki se de denege sem gewa chola tembe jamba de an dela nido ki se bezo jera ka che mo je dusin yogu yargi duguri so jamba dela ki se jamba dela nido ki se denege sem gewa la tembe dusin nyamne jeba ina sem gewa la tembe jamba de gidi ina da dusin ani ne bezo jera ja ma wa je dela wo chen yogu ane yargi duguri se che sumo jamba dela nido ki se
If we look first at the first line, from being close to the spiritual mentor. So here, by being both physically and emotionally close to our teacher, we will be receptive to his subsequent teachings. So the Pith instructions or the teachings that we receive, we'll seek them out, we'll embrace them with joy and with eagerness. And in particular, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for our teacher and the kindness that he has shown, we'll want to strive in the three higher trainings. And we'll do so also motivated by fear of wasting this precious opportunity and the karmic consequences that follow from not radically, from the karmic consequences that can potentially follow if we remain without a greatly developed mind. So using this then as inspiration, we strive to cultivate our spiritual teacher's teachings within us in precisely the way presented. And this is further enhanced by our devotion to those of good fortune. Those of good fortune include our spiritual teachers and all other bodhisattvas. Through the expression of this devotion, we commit to strive to cultivate all good qualities, those same good qualities that they possess. The indispensable way to do so is through relying at all times on mindfulness and vigilance. Then we come to the fourth line. This is the way, so through following this method of the first three lines, mindfulness arises. And it doesn't require extensive effort if these prior causes are cultivated well. It will arise, mindfulness will arise and abide swiftly and with ease.
lama dine la me song she be ge and ji chue de ane and song dine sam da je and temba de ya and di ma je ne ji ge la ba dan ge wi ge je ba ne di pa sa ge dine ngang song le ge ne du ngang yong re sem be ge dine ge sam da je and ba temba ge wi temba de ya sem de ge wal je ya dine and ji ge lame sonshaba majeba na lame katan kagri chesa lame kachana yabo mare sambe samtaje na gewi nyamna che ya dosin an shengi cheba de pe yabore sambe ge dele ya ngushe kuyu ngushepke ndele ya konzo cheba ne nge ya chigin sambe samtaje ya jamba kewa che ya dosin semne gewi tamba 그게디나 도chen 개월 받다 도에 제지 도시 전국으로 해서지 당주 돌단 인보데 디레 근데 진 디나 슈바 대주 슈바 나진 아주 다셈 템바 개위나 템바 다들에 게디나 저기 자와 가르체베나 할라사와다 디네나 컨트롤 최고 피야라서 받아 디네게 진 아주 메도다 연주를 표현하게 게디나 컨트롤 최고 피야 텐투야 닝은 건조스미 안데 잠도 삼다투야 게딘다 다가질 강아 가니시나 동안에 교바 뉴바 쳄는 건조스 교고리 선배 쳄는 건조 이치제야 안데 소수게다 게 시행게 강아로 제다 진리게 통선나 닝제 선배 니제 권에 삼 닝제 그 동아데다 저와 쇼 선배 삼다야 시행직 파소 추보자다 되는 지미다 되는 통배네 안데 저 오다 건조게네 진요모베 컨트롤 나자 녀모베 게어다 삼는 녀모베 게어다 미디 라와 요마레 선배 미디레 닝지게야 나 건조게 녀모베데 삼로디게 파 마메버쇼 선배게 대단 잘데 아니 녀모베데 파 차제 셈리야 시디단 디기 중어 쇼 선배 누치네 삼다다 이게 누치네 양안주게다 대시 주반한 시간주게 지금 파소 공부하게 줘야다 되네기 르제라 조베나 당연히 현래 판도제발의 류디 근데 지게 대화치고 류디 진내매 체령지 마주반의 현래 판도 주토서 말대자 현래 판도 주야 된다 인생배 삼다다 소소의 레가로 지가르치네 레가디 제바드네 현기 동화세야 된 디기주의 현래 펜바지 용어 쇼스베게 되네게 삼냐야 다샤베나 다나디 두신 삼다베 나아주 셈디 계획에 개월을 간자로 템바디다 기위네 기디네 심네 개월 바디네 개수를 차지고 와 두시네 삼당고를 해서지 내송고를 받아다 님보디 삼당나로 두스당고를 해서지.
To summarize then what we've looked at tonight in the 29th and 30th verses, we need to keep our mind on virtue at all times. This means we need to develop stable mindfulness. So our mind will, throughout the day, move between various objects. We'll be thinking of various things, but we need to ensure that at all times it stays on virtue. And the way to bring this about is through relying on a close connection with our spiritual teacher and through cultivating a deep sense of gratitude for their kindness and illuminating the path to enlightenment for us. We commit to repaying them in the most meaningful of ways, which is to strive in cultivating their teachings within, to transform our mind through applying ourselves to train our mind precisely in the way guided. And this is further enhanced by our devotion to our teachers and all the Bodhisattvas. And the way to express this devotion is, again, to train in the way guided, and to do so, whatever topic requires mindfulness and vigilance. These are indispensable to ensure that the mind, through mindfulness, remains on the virtuous objects, and through vigilance, the afflictions do not sneak up on us, overwhelm us. And then, with this strong in us, we ensure that these wholesome minds that we cultivate, they are not sporadic. They don't only have an occasional impact on us, but at all times. It's not sufficient to merely have the Dharma in our mind when you're reading a book or hearing a teaching or meditating. We need to have it dominant in our mind when we're interacting with others and when we're alone. So as I mentioned both earlier tonight and in previous weeks, when about to eat or drink something, offer that, and not offer that as a mere discipline of a vocal expression, but with sincerity. Offer it with gratitude to all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And moreover, when engaging in various activities such as the illustration I gave with exercising, develop a virtuous motivation. Recognize you are exercising so that your body can be healthy and you can have a longer, more comfortable life in order to cultivate the Dharma within, in order to be of ever more benefit to others. And likewise, with whatever various activities in your own individual lives you engage in your home, in your place of work, or within the community, cultivate the motivation beforehand that I'm going to engage in this, whether it's a mundane or a great activity, to be of benefit to others, both directly and indirectly, and develop this motivation in a sincere manner and keep it alive within you as you go about your day. And in this way, you will, with ease and quickly, develop your mindfulness, because you're cultivating it at all times, keeping the mind virtuous, and thereby you're creating great stores of merit too. Then thank you. We can conclude there for this week. Thank you very much.